I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I am Jesse Lawler. This is episode 9. We are going to be breaking double digits on the podcast next week, which I find extremely exciting. Hopefully you find that a little bit exciting. If you've been listening for all 9 episodes so far, then you must like it a little bit, so that's cool. Let's see, what am I talking about this week? First of all, I should acknowledge right off the bat that I'm just about as caffeinated as I have ever been in any of the previous episodes, possibly more so, and if I'm talking a little bit fast and kind of bouncing around, I've got a chemical excuse for it this time. We're all old enough to know that chemical excuses are generally not good excuses, but, well, nevertheless. If you stick around until the ruthless listener retention gimmick at the end of the episode, I'm going to tell you something that has something to do with caffeine and how it can be used kind of counterintuitively as a sleep aid. Sleep aid is not really the right term for what this actually is, but it's a tip that does involve both caffeine and sleep, so I'll just leave it at that. We had an amazingly interesting interview this week with David Pearce. David is a philosopher, not one of the dead ones, but one of the living ones, who's around right now. He's a citizen of the UK and a very, very well-versed guy on science. And, sometimes you kind of forget that, philosophers generally know a heck of a lot about the modern science of the time, because oftentimes it's new scientific discoveries that are kind of opening new grounds to question what humanity should be doing, which I guess is sort of the core question of philosophy. Anyway, yeah, David is, among other things, he's the co-founder of the World Transhumanist Association and spends an awful lot of time thinking about what humans can and should be doing to press towards this future where we're going to have just amazing technological capacities, and we're sort of moving into what he calls a post-Darwinian era, where it's no longer really a fight over resources and mates that is driving what we are becoming as a species anymore. It's much more parents have the ability to pick the genome of their children before their children are born, and this accelerating non-survival based ability to control our own genetic future, which is really, really pretty neat. But anyway, we'll get to that soon. First of all, let's do This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts. This Week in Neuroscience.
The question raises its head once again of how much does size matter? In this case, we're talking about the corpus callosum. What is the corpus callosum, you ask? Well, if you think of the human brain as being kind of like, the meaty part of a walnut, you got these two halves. There's a kind of a slice down the middle and then a smaller piece that connects the two halves and holds them together. The corpus callosum would be that little piece that connects the two halves in the human brain. It is a tightly packed bundle of nerve fibers, millions and millions and millions of fibers across. It provides communication between the two halves of the brain, and what they've found is that it is notably thicker in musicians who have started studying music before the age of 7 than in non-musicians or musicians who started studying music later in life. So apparently there's kind of a target period that kids need to start learning some of these musical skills before that age, or it's not going to happen at all. This would be an example of neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the ability of the brain to develop itself and have morphological features that arise or do not arise based on the environment that it finds itself in within the world, not based on sort of the genomic inheritance from its parents. So pretty interesting stuff. It means if you're an aspiring stage parent, you really want your kid to be first chair at the Vienna Orchestra or something like that, you better get that kid started early, because it's going to have some definite impacts on their brain that just won't be possible if you don't start them until middle school or whatever. Take that with a grain of salt or not. Take that with a pill of paracetam, and let's move on.
Smart Drug Smarts.
Okay, so we're about to dive into the main interview with David Pearce. Before we do so, I want to give you kind of a little crib notes on what David's all about as a philosopher, so when we start throwing around terms like hedonic treadmill, you'll know what the heck we're talking about. So David is best known for his book, The Hedonic Imperative, and basically this is kind of a manifesto that he's written talking about what humans should be doing with our advancing technological capabilities as we get them and move towards this future where we're going to have sort of godlike scientific powers, what we should do with those powers. So he makes the point that all creatures at all times are sort of somewhere on this spectrum between absolute misery and just total euphoric joy. And he calls the point that we're at sort of our by default for any given creature is its hedonic set point. Kind of, are you typically miserable, or are you typically pretty happy, or where do you fall on that range? Anyway, so David's point is that our goal, sort of morally, ethically, as we gain increasing capabilities technologically, is that we should be trying to move, probably first humans and eventually all creatures as high up the scale as we possibly can, away from the misery end of the spectrum and towards the euphoric joy end of the spectrum. So basically be shifting the hedonic set point of everything to the right. And that's pretty much all the information you need to get started. So let's just dive right in. To start things off, just for people that are not familiar with your work so far, could you kind of give the elevator pitch for your vision of the future, or at least the future that we should be aiming for, that you talk about in the hedonistic imperative?
In a nutshell, I think we should be aiming to use biotechnology to of suffering, not just in humans, but also ultimately in non-human animals too. Now, it would be possible to do so in humans and non-humans today with something very crude like wireheading or implanting electrodes in our reward centers. But this is not a viable or a sustainable future. There would be selection pressure against it for a start. And so my particular focus is on ways to use biotechnology, psychopharmacology, and in the long run genetic engineering to recalibrate the hedonic treadmill in such a way that one's normal hedonic set point, i.e. the average level of well-being one enjoys throughout one's lifetime, is vastly higher than today, but at the same time make sure that intellectual function and cognitive performance is unimpaired and ideally enhanced. One knows today that there are a small minority of people who are extraordinarily happy but also productive, i.e. their hedonic set point is extremely high, but they're not clinically manic or anything like that. I very much hope that it's going to be possible to elevate the rest of the population to that kind of level of sustained well-being, and in the much longer term, ensure that our children, grandchildren, and beyond can enjoy incomparably richer lives than we standardly do today.
That's a great synopsis. One of the things that struck me when I was reading about your work was, I'm sort of wondering, like, okay, if we're looking at a future where misery has essentially been abolished, and where the most miserable that a person might ever feel in their life is kind of a dull, I'm somewhat less euphoric than I normally am, but I'm still euphoric compared to the 2013 level of sort of the spectrum between misery and joy. Do people, would people living in that sort of a future just recalibrate what their definition of misery is?
Intuitively, pleasure and pain are largely, and that to appreciate the good things in life, one has to suffer the bad. But one only needs to think today of people who sadly endure chronic pain and or depression. There are some depressive people who aren't happy. Some days maybe not so awful as others, but essentially they're chronically depressed, can't even imagine what it's like to be happy or even what the word happy means. At the other end of the spectrum, there are a very small minority of people who really are essentially happy all their lives, which is not to say that some days aren't even better than others, but lead incredibly rich lives. Essentially, natural selection has played around with the dial settings. Most of us a lot of the time experience discontent and malaise, and it's still going to be possible in future to have the functional analogues of something like low mood or anxiety or disappointment, but there's no need to have the raw feels, and one can have as much contrast as one wants. From an information theoretic perspective, what's critical is not an absolute point on the hedonic or dolorous scale, but differences. I mean, information has even been just defined as a difference that makes a difference. Yes, this combination of super happiness and super intelligence, and also, I would hope, super longevity is what I think we should be aiming for in the long term.
There's a lot of difference, obviously, a lot of ground to cover between a future like that and the place where we are today. What do you see as some of the reasonable intermediary steps, and what are the likelihood that we'll be able to correctly take those intermediary steps rather than veering off into some much less desirable, but still probably very high-tech version of the future?
Well, I think probably the first advice one can give, it's not very exciting or high tech at all, is getting one's diet and aerobic exercise regimen right, and yes, optimizing one's diet so that one is cutting out junk food, only eating, almost entirely eating superfoods, making sure one gets daily aerobic exercise, sleep discipline. That is the bedrock of good cognition and also well-being. Of course, some people do absolutely everything right, and yet they would like to fine-tune their brains much further, both cognitively and also somehow to raise their mood. Links between diet, exercise, mood, and cognition, they may be subtle, but they're still extremely important. So that's the first thing I would probably recommend anyone before even considering the pharmacological options. If one is looking at the different drugs and interventions available right now, starting at the supplements ends, something like omega-3 supplements. If you're a vegan like me, you'll probably want to use flaxseed oil. If you're a non-vegan, you'd be more likely to use fish oil. All sorts of drugs will improve cognitive performance on a number of tests, but let's take, for instance, something like the psychostimulants, ranging from quite gentle ones like modafinil to Ritalin or the amphetamines. Although there can be short-term gains, I mean, a lot of these drugs effectively acting simply by improving the signal-to-noise ratio, which is okay for certain purposes if one is doing a certain kind of task or certain kind of thought, but is probably not good if you want to prep up your creative juices or something like that. I mean, there's a reason why, for instance, that often one has interesting and creative ideas when one is drifting off to sleep, and that's because one's in a hypercholinergic state. Whereas if you take these, let's say, a psychostimulant that is boosting noradrenaline and dopamine function, you may be feeling sharp and focused. It's also worth bearing in mind that some of these drugs that apparently do improve performance can also have adverse side effects. So that's just one example of the need for caution. Another possible intervention to take would be something like one of the racetams, of which piracetam is the oldest and the best tested. Precisely how they work isn't understood, but cholinergic function, acetylcholine, the neurotransmitter, seems to be important. Piracetam, for instance, enhances function of the muscarinic cholinergic receptors. But I mentioned side effects. It's not coincidence that drugs with anticholinergic properties, though they also can impair intellectual performance, they can also raise mood, and some people will find that boosting cholinergic function will actually subdue their mood. So there are trade-offs here too. So one needs to approach these drugs with caution.
Absolutely. Are there any, obviously, I think what you said about sort of laying the groundwork with a healthy diet and, consistent exercise is absolutely the best advice, and something that I keep hearing from person after person as I do these interviews. So everyone pretty much seems agreed that, getting your body such as it was given to you by nature in order first before layering anything on top is the best way to start. Is there anything personally that you do that you take in the smart drugs realm for sort of that next level of performance?
Well, I do take a number of drugs and supplements, but such is biochemical individuality, I'm not particularly recommending anyone emulate my regimen. And a complicating factor in my case is that I am also taking them for mood and motivation. Ammoneptin, which is the dopamine reuptake inhibitor. I take selegiline, also known as L-deprenyl, which is a selective irreversible monoamine oxidase type B inhibitor, which also enhances dopamine function. They leave me more alert. I sleep slightly less, but once again, I think probably they do increase signal-to-noise ratio, which is good in engaging in a Darwinian world, but they can also create a degree of inattention. They're not particularly touchy-feely. And yes, in the context of my own particular circumstances, and they wouldn't suit anyone, for instance, who is prone to anxiety disorders. I do explore a number of other agents, such as JDIC, for instance, which is a kappa opioid antagonist, which seems to have nootropic properties. And over the years, I've explored a number of different options too. But on the whole, I'm not like some pill pushers, pill swallowers. I'm actually extremely cautious before a lot of these experiments. Yes, not as many pills and potions as you might imagine.
Well, obviously, you're very, very well researched on this subject, and so I think that people listening will understand that simply because you're naming something off doesn't mean it's a blanket recommendation for people. Reading about your vision of the future, I find it hard to imagine what sort of the average mental day in the life of transhuman future individuals, such as you describe, would be. It seems like the idea of flushing all the remnants of suffering and unpleasantness out of not just one person but all of society would be so transformative that it would be thinking about like what's it like to be an octopus. It doesn't. I don't feel much commonality with these theoretical people in the future. Do you think that our generation of humans will live to evolve into, transform into, become this thing, or is this future somewhere off in the distance that we won't live to see?
The more radical forms of what one might call paradise engineering, I think, lie in the future. But in terms of our own lives, I think later years one associates them with decline and decrepitude, but they may well be the most wonderful years of our lives. And I'm not just talking about the possibility of radical anti-aging interventions. I'm talking about designer drugs, possibly gene therapy. But the earlier part of your question, will it still really be us? Well, look, let's consider the most wonderful and sublime peak experience of your whole life. Now imagine if experiences of that quality were just your default condition of well-being, because once one identifies the molecular signatures of some particular class of experience, whether it's aesthetic or religious, spiritual, emotional, or what have you, once one is isolated, one can then overexpress it within the brain and fine-tune it. In the long run, I think this is going to be done via genetic engineering. In the short term, it can be done with designer drugs. But I think the critical thing that one should really be aiming for is sustainability, in that there are all sorts of drugs on the market today that can boost mood and cognition, but they're short term and they simply kick into gear the negative feedback mechanisms of the brain. And I think our focus should be on long-term and sustainable well-being, both intellectual and emotional well-being, not highs followed by lows, which is all too common in the sphere of recreational drugs today, for example.
To pull you back to that question, do you feel much commonality with this future transhuman race that you sort of posit? Like, do you feel like they are still you? I mean, is it like, I feel like when I look back, on our genetic heritage, and I look back on the sea slug, I'm like, yeah, we've got common ancestors with the sea slug in a way that one could argue that we wouldn't be here were it not for the sea slug, or whatever. But on the other hand, I don't really feel much commonality or much interest in the sea slug's problems. I don't want to watch a movie all about sea slugs. These future people might feel a total lack of interest, or at least lack of commonality with us, in our present state, just because of sort of the gulf of experiential difference. It's just a lot to wrap your mind around.
Oh, indeed. I mean, in one sense, I think we share something important with the sea slug, roundworms, pigs, chimpanzees, and fellow humans, and that is the pleasure-pain axis, and that our core emotions we share with fellow vertebrates. And so in that sense, I can feel a commonality with our post-human successors enjoying gradients of intelligent bliss. But no, I totally take on board, I mean, compared to just the the average humdrum, often squalid, messy Darwinian life of today, the notion of post-human smart angels, one doesn't identify as closely as one might. But I mean, yeah, just cast your mind back to, yeah, let's say your 5-year-old or 10-year-old namesake. Do you identify with him? I think what really troubles people is that they might lose something precious, something valuable. I can't discount this, but one of the advantages of trying to recalibrate the hedonic treadmill, i.e. to elevate your hedonic set point, is that you can still conserve, if you want to, your existing values and preferences. That it needn't involve giving them up. It just means that your default state of well-being, I hope it's default state of well-being, is much richer than it is now.
Yeah, and I think the metaphysical sort of calculations that go into even talking about this kind of stuff are interesting to people. It's it's very much something where people sit around at 10 o'clock in the evening and drink a bottle of wine while they stare off into space and think about these issues. But I mean, it's something that everybody I think at some point likes to sit back and contemplate the big questions, and these certainly are among them. What do you see as, I guess, the likelihood of a future such as the one that you're promoting, that you're advocating, coming to pass versus any of the other sort of dystopian visions of the future that various sci-fi authors have put out there, and that we see more of those than we do of the truly paradise engineering visions of the future.
Dystopias are much more interesting. It's very, very difficult to do an interesting, illuminating novel or movie goes right about paradise, which is not to say that all sorts of things could go wrong. And yeah, I sketched different scenarios by which we may decide to phase out suffering. For instance, I think we're going to shortly be choosing the genetic makeup of our children, and genes promoting or predisposing to depression and anxiety disorders are going to be very strongly selected against. And conversely, genes, for instance, that promote various forms of intellectual ability are likely to be, or variant alleles promoting intellectual ability are likely to be selected by prospective parents. But what the long-term outcome will be, it's very difficult to know. And what will be the nature of selection pressure, for instance, in an era where everyone has their own genome sequenced, who most people use pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to choose the makeup of their future children, very difficult to anticipate. So why am I confident, at all confident then, that we're going to phase out suffering? Simply ask yourself this. Imagine if you could, as is possible today, to a limited degree, if you were to use pre-implantation genetic diagnosis and choose the genetic makeup of your children. This is done now in the case of if your children may be predisposed to cystic fibrosis or something, and it's used quite widely in India and China just to make sure you don't endure the misfortune of having a girl. But imagine if you were able to choose the dial settings for hedonic tone of your future offspring, where, let's say, 10 is a predisposition to spend one's life super happy and minus 10 is super miserable. You might not want to have super happy children, but on the whole, you will probably want to have pretty happy children. They're more fun to raise. And you'll also be able increasingly to choose genes that predispose from everything to empathy, sociability, and yes, though it's a very controversial topic, intelligence.
Yeah, I find it hard to imagine that if they have intelligence worked out well enough where they can turn up the dials, what parent wouldn't choose to have a smarter child? I think that's going to be a really interesting issue as that becomes more and more real. The ability to genetically determine an offspring's what they're going to be born with, because that technology will improve year by year. And it's like, well, honey, do we want to have a baby this year, or do we want to wait 2 more years and be able to do further upgrades? And like,
yes,
it's going to be hard to justify. I mean, it's actually what it's going to be. It's going to be great for men, because men are always like, let's just wait a couple more years before you get pregnant. And the women are always, I want to have the baby now. It's like, but the guys are going to have a great new quiver in their arrow of logical defenses for waiting a little while.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I said it's now we take it for granted that sexual reproduction, it's a lottery. Let's see what happens. But I think the responsible thing for prospective parents to do will be to make intelligent choices. Yes, initially these choices may be quite crude, but they're going to improve in sophistication and precision. Yeah, other things being equal, that by ensuring one has a child who enjoys invincible mental super health, invincible physical super health, one is enriching the opportunities for one's future child. That unfortunately, yes, people cast their minds back, particularly in the West, to the experience of the 20th century and the Third Reich, and that's so that there's this taboo word, eugenics. But the Chinese have a very different historical memory, for instance, from the West, and I think they're almost certainly going to go ahead. I'm worried that a very one-dimensional conception of intelligence is going to be selected for the kind of intelligence that involves mathematical ability, the kind of intelligence scored by IQ tests, not Shakespearean-like intelligence that involves extremely rich mind-reading skills, verbal prowess. I very much hope that we're going to elaborate a richer conception of intelligence too. But again, this is speculative.
You know, I would almost say that the opposite seems more likely, because if you look at the way that power tends to accrue in human societies, it tends to be people that have very strong social skills, more so than people that are particularly mathematically inclined. I feel like the people right now that are the scientists that would really be involved in, pushing forward the next generation of neural enhancement through genetics or anything else are pretty on board with the idea that purely mathematical intelligence is and what is generally tested with IQ tests is not sort of a full spectrum way of looking at intelligence, and that the multiple intelligences that you mentioned are very real things, and that although it might be tougher to quantitatively analyze them, that they're certainly still worth considering. And so given that the scientists that are going to be involved in developing these enhancement technologies are already sort of on board with the ideas you're talking about, I tend to sort of take an optimistic view that it won't just be skewed totally in favor of, I guess sort of the, more rote memory, testosterone driven, spit out numbers as fast as you can type of intelligence.
I would like to think so. Martin Gardner's multiple intelligences model is not widely esteemed in academia, but yes, many researchers are aware of the limitations of existing intelligence tests. I would argue for a complete overhaul of our existing notions of intelligence as tested for by standard mind-blind IQ tests. I think they lack ecological validity, and yes, they involve systematically mismeasuring intelligence in all sorts of ways. But this is a contested field. Intelligence, basically, it's a mixture of the factual and the evaluative, because critical on most people's conceptions of intelligence is the ability to assess what is and isn't important. And inevitably, whoever is actually designing the tests is actually choosing what abilities they do and don't think are significant.
Yeah. I mean, that which kind of brings us back to the idea of what the heck are these future people going to do in a world without suffering? It's like, what are you trying to optimize your intelligence for once that problem has already been solved? It's like, and I'm sure you've got a pithy answer for that, but it's kind of seems like the end product of society is complete the moment that the last drop of suffering has been milked out of the world.
Well, I certainly think that the basis of any future civilization worthy of the name should be the abolition of all involuntary suffering. But I don't see this as the ultimate goal, but more of just the springboard and point of departure. Intuitively, one imagines that, well, if people were happy, well, we'd just sit around all day and wouldn't do anything. But if you look at the very happiest people alive today, they also tend to be the most motivated, the most driven. The day is too short for them. It seems as though hedonic tone and motivation are actually neurologically distinct in the brain, even though they're intimately interconnected. hedonic tone is very much a function of the mu opioid system, in particular in our twin hedonic hotspots, whereas motivation is a function of the mesolimbic dopamine system, and that one can independently, in principle at any rate, amplify or diminish motivation and hedonic tone. The more motivated one is, the broader the range of different stimuli one finds rewarding. So if anything, I think that enriching mood and phasing out suffering is actually going to lead to a knowledge explosion. Now, how on earth can I justify something like that? You may well be thinking. But here is one example, in that today I don't think one can really safely and responsibly urge people to try psychedelics for all sorts of reasons, but essentially because of the possibility of bad trips. We have dark Darwinian minds, and who knows what surprises lie in store. But once one has actually got the molecular genetic substrates of invincible well-being in place, one can safely and responsibly and systematically explore psychedelia. Admittedly, this is, when one speaks of psychedelics, one is not talking about nootropics or smart drugs in the conventional sense, but by immensely enriching the state space of different states of mind and consciousness, I think tomorrow's psychedelics explored by super happy people, yes, will immeasurably enrich our conception of ourselves and the world. But they're not an instant route to nirvana or wisdom or anything like that. It's a rather lamer analogy. It's rather like today, if in a tribe of blind super rationalists, if someone takes a drug that gives them visual experiences, they're going to be bewildered, confused. They'll be convinced that these weird visual experiences are profoundly significant, and yet they won't understand them. And indeed, it takes, scientifically today, it takes years. If someone who's congenitally blind is given the gift of sight, it takes them years to be able to master vision. And likewise, I think today, the psychedelics that psychonauts explore, essentially we haven't got the conceptual tools. We don't really understand the nature of the state spaces of experience they're opening up.
And I guess, part of me thinks that the whole point of exploration is you don't know what's there before you get there, and you need to sort of be willing to, acknowledge in advance that you may or may not like it. But I guess the whole point of what you're talking about is that you want assurance that you're going to like it before you get there, which on ethical grounds, I mean, I can't say you're wrong, but that seems like kind of, it would be terrible to go to a casino in your vision of the future because you'd always win.
Well, there are different sizes of payoffs. Even in paradise, one can have the functional equivalent of a bad hair day, but essentially it will still be wonderfully rewarding. I mean, so life itself, by its very, very nature, will be wonderful. Whereas today, sadly, there are, as well as people who want to live forever, plenty of people for whom time hangs heavy and life drags on too long. And if we're going to phase out the nasty side of life and enrich the quality of life for just average people leading humdrum lives, yes, we're actually going to have to tackle the biological roots of malaise.
Given where we are now and where you want to go, what is ethically okay with you as far as the further steps on the road?
Ethically, I confess I am a utilitarian, technically a negative utilitarian, and one of the common arguments against utilitarianism, it seems to involve this all kinds of unpleasant or obnoxious or immoral behavior is permissible, actually, if it leads to a more wonderful goal. I also think on indirect utilitarian grounds, it's best to have certain absolute prohibitions enshrined in law. Thus, I don't think it is acceptable to do experiments on other subjects of experience without their informed consent, and that our treatment of non-human animals is absolutely appalling. And I'm not just talking about experiments, I'm talking about factory farming and slaughterhouses. And so, yes, I think it is very important to keep our moral compass and not allow ourselves to harm other sentient beings on the grounds that yes, we have a glorious goal ahead. But as you rightly observed, yes, we are descended from murderers, rapists, and goodness knows what else. We wouldn't be here today if they hadn't done what they had done. But this is not a justification of murder or rape.
Hey, that's my mom you're talking about, mister.
Indeed.
Alrighty, well, I think we can wrap this up for now. I really, really appreciate your time. I think this is going to be really interesting to people, and yeah, I look forward to talking with you again in the future. It's been a real pleasure.
Cheers, Jesse. All the best. Take care. Bye-bye.
Big thank you once again for David Pearce joining us on this episode, and really, I think, thinking some very big thoughts, and certainly, I think, the kinds of things that David is thinking about and giving honest, like very deep levels of attention to are so much grander than I think, certainly speaking for myself, than I think about on a day-to-day basis. And it's really pretty awesome to take a step back and think about some of those big what-if questions and what next questions that are very much worth considering, and I think oftentimes kind of get overlooked with the minutiae that we all deal with on a day-to-day basis. Anyway, moving right along, straight to more minutiae. As promised in the Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick, I said I was going to tell you something about both sleep and caffeine. Actually, we should play that sound effect now.
Smart Drug Smarts, Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
All right, as promised, both sleep and caffeine coming to you like peanut butter and jelly in an amazing combination you would never expect. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Jesse, caffeine is the natural enemy of sleep. How could they ever get along nicely and play well together? Well, here's how. So, okay, the afternoon siesta. We've talked about them before. Everybody agrees that neurologically naps are a good thing. Sleep is pretty much always a good thing neurologically. And taking the afternoon nap and then popping awake after that can give you significant mental boost for the rest of the day as far as both just general alertness and decision-making powers in particular. So how is caffeine going to help you with this? Well, it turns out that caffeine does not actually make its way out your stomach lining, into your bloodstream, all that stuff immediately. I know it feels like sometimes you just smell the caffeine and that wakes you up, but that's much more Pavlovian conditioning than it is actual real stuff going on within your system. It's actually about 25 minutes for caffeine to hit your bloodstream in most cases. So if you drink a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, something like that, get some caffeine into your system and then immediately lay down for your siesta, it's just about 25 minutes that caffeine will be making its way into your bloodstream. You'll naturally wake up, so you'll be invigorated by both the nap that you just took and the caffeine that's at that point sort of coursing through your bloodstream. So it's a pretty awesome little double win power play there. So give that a try and let me know what you think. Pre-nap time caffeination. Impress your friends, amaze your enemies.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart we have smart in our title twice.
So there's episode 9, Cruising in for a Landing, and thank you very much for hanging till the end of the episode. If you liked what you heard, definitely spread the word, and sorry, I wasn't trying to rhyme there, it just kind of happened. But yeah, tell people about this podcast and the website www.smartdrugsmarts.com, where we're going to have all the show notes for this week's show. If you want to click on something, for example, like the World Transhumanist Association, we will have a link there. We're going to have links to all kinds of stuff. And in fact, the website's going to get a little bit more interesting in coming weeks in that I want to give people a way to let one another know about what smart drugs they're taking, what smart things you're doing, and kind of, share some tips and tricks among the community for brain optimization. People have been finding out about this podcast and been getting some really good feedback, but I'd love that feedback to go out further than just myself and really be able to be something that could be shared amongst the community. On the other hand, if you're one of those super smart James Bond megavillain types and you're hiding in a castle somewhere, assembling an army of drones and waiting to take the rest of us over when we least expect it, I'd like to say screw you on behalf of the larger majority of the nice folks in the Smart Drug Smarts community who really just want to share some brain hacking tips. Hopefully we'll rise up to defeat you, you evil bastard. But if you feel like being sporting and maybe dropping me an email before your planned apocalypse, that'd be cool too. And we'll, the rest of us, if we survive your purge, we'll, erect a statue of you later or do something generally useful. So either evil or good, I hope you join us next week. Same time, same podcast, and the same unflagging commitment to helping you better your own brain. See you next week, folks.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization.